They say moving to the suburbs is a promise, a quiet life, good schools, friendly neighbors, and peace behind a white picket fence. That's what I thought too, until I discovered that beneath the manicured lawns and painted smiles, something darker was growing. It wasn't crime in the streets or danger in the shadows. No, it was control. Silent, smiling control. The kind that finds you for your flower beds, that watches your every move from across the hedge. I came here to rebuild a life. I didn't expect to go to war with people who believed they ruled this street. But when they burned my car to send a message, they made one mistake. They picked the wrong man. And I was done staying silent. The sun poured over the cul-de-sac like honey, slow and golden. Juniper Hollow, on the outskirts of Scottsdale, Arizona, looked like it belonged on a real estate brochure. Tree-lined streets, designer mailboxes, and picture-perfect lawns trimmed to regulation height. It was the kind of neighborhood that whispered of order and pride and the illusion of peace. To Ethan Cole, it was supposed to be a new start. After 17 years as a federal cybercrime investigator and the sudden loss of his wife to a rare illness, Ethan needed space for himself and for Jaden, his 9-year-old son who hadn't smiled much since the funeral. Juniper Hollow seemed like a good place to breathe again. Quiet, safe, uncomplicated. They moved in on a Saturday. By Tuesday, the first letter arrived. It was folded precisely, tucked in a generic HOA envelope, and placed strangely inside their unlocked mailbox. No postage, no signature, just a typed warning. Dear resident, your trash bins were visible from the street past designated hours. Consider this a courtesy notice, Juniper Council. Ethan frowned. There was no HOA agreement in his purchase documents. His property was one of the 5 in the neighborhood legally not under HOA jurisdiction, something he had verified twice during closing. He tossed the letter and thought little of it. Then came another. This time, it warned about the color of his exterior lighting fixtures. The third came with a fine $150 for unauthorized lawn decorations, which turned out to be Jaden's tiny plastic solar owl planted in the flower bed. Ethan kept his calm. He wrote back formally, stating that his property was exempt from HOA authority. No response. Instead, the notes became more frequent, more aggressive. Typed letters turned into hand-delivered warnings. One morning, he stepped outside to find someone had taped a notice to his door, red ink, bold font. Final warning. Non-compliance will not be tolerated. That was the first time Ethan felt something stir inside him. It wasn't fear. It was recognition, the kind of passive-aggressive authoritarianism he'd encountered before. Only this time, it wore cardigans and name badges instead of suits and wiretaps. He started keeping records, documenting everything. Jaden noticed, too. "Dad," he said one evening as they watered the backyard together, "why do the people here act like we're in trouble?" Ethan looked at his son's face, pale in the dusk light. Jaden hadn't asked for this restart. He'd already been through more loss than any kid deserved. "We're not in trouble," Ethan said softly. "Sometimes people get loud when they're used to being obeyed, but that doesn't mean they're right." The next week, someone rang his doorbell at 6:42 a.m. It was a woman late, 50s crisp polo, clipboard in hand, name tag that read, Clarice Wynn, HOA President. "Good morning," she chirped, in that fake cheerful tone that always meant trouble. "We've noticed some persistent non-compliance and thought we should talk." Ethan stayed calm. "My house isn't part of the HOA. It never was. It's on the county record." Clarice didn't blink. "That may have been true once, but we've passed a unanimous resolution to incorporate the remaining properties. You're now under community standards." "That's not how law works," Ethan said flatly. "Well," she smiled, "maybe it's time you became a team player. No one likes a holdout." He closed the door without another word. That night, Jaden's chalk drawing, a bright blue dinosaur on the sidewalk, was scrubbed clean with a pressure washer. The next day, their mailbox was left slightly ajar. Nothing inside. Just open. A signal. Ethan knew this dance. Threats disguised as concern. Pressure, pretending to be policy. He'd seen it overseas. He'd seen it in data leaks. Now, he was seeing it in his front yard, wrapped in HOA language and fake courtesy. He installed motion-activated cameras. Logged everything. The digital trail was forming. He thought the worst they'd do was fine him into exhaustion. He was wrong, because 3 nights later, at 2:17 a.m., Ethan woke to the sound of glass cracking and fire snapping. He ran to the window and saw a pillar of flame engulfing his black SUV, the one parked 2 feet from Jaden's bedroom. He grabbed the fire extinguisher. Too late. The engine block exploded in a fireball that shook the street. Neighbors stepped outside in pajamas, mouths agape. Someone screamed. Another called 911. But Ethan? He didn't scream. He stood there, barefoot on the pavement, watching his car burn, a silent fury tightening in his chest. He didn't call the police. He called someone else. "This is Ethan Cole," he said into the phone. "Badge ID 14297. I need to report an incident of suspected felony arson tied to a local corruption ring. You're going to want to send federal agents. Yes, now." By sunrise, all that remained of Ethan's SUV was a smoldering steel carcass and the melted outlines of taillights. The smell of scorched rubber and fuel clung to the air like a warning. But Ethan wasn't rattled. He'd seen worse in the field. He just never expected to find it here, in a gated suburban neighborhood with roses trimmed into perfect symmetry. Jaden hadn't seen the blaze. Ethan had woken him only after the fire was out, guiding him gently away from the chaos, telling him the car had a mechanical issue. He wouldn't traumatize his son any more than he already had. Not yet. By 8 a.m., neighbors were milling about in carefully hushed curiosity. Some whispered from behind half-closed doors. A few offered performative sympathy, but most just watched. The HOA's golden emblem glinted from their mailbox plaques like quiet reminders of who really ran this place. Clarice Wynn showed up around 9:15, dressed in a crisp beige pantsuit and sunglasses, coffee in hand, flanked by 2 HOA board members like they were her personal security detail. She stood just far enough to look concerned, but close enough to smirk without speaking. Ethan didn't approach her. He didn't need to. Because at exactly 10:02 a.m., 2 black SUVs with government plates turned into Juniper Hollow. Federal. No sirens. No drama. Just clinical efficiency. 4 agents stepped out, one in a blazer, the rest in tactical casual attire. All business. They didn't knock. They walked directly up to Ethan, identified themselves with badges. "Mr. Cole, we received your request. I'm Special Agent Dana Ramirez, Cybercrime and Arson Task Force." Ethan nodded. "Appreciate the quick response." Ramirez surveyed the charred remains of the car. High-temperature accelerant, flash ignition, targeted strike. They knew what they were doing. "Oh, they thought they did," Ethan replied dryly. What they didn't know was who they were doing it to. The agents began collecting evidence melt patterns, fragments, soil samples, while Ramirez spoke quietly with Ethan on the porch. He handed her a flash drive. Surveillance footage from the house and motion sensors. 2 masked individuals, gloves, spray accelerant, timed ignition. "I've enhanced the footage, ran facial recognition overlays, one match came up soft. Guy named Reese Milner, former security contractor. Suspended license." Ramirez raised an eyebrow. "You've been busy," Ethan shrugged. "Old habits die hard." "And this HOA you mentioned, Juniper Council?" "Non-existent in the legal sense," Ethan said. "No registration with the Arizona Corporations Commission. No tax filings. No articles of incorporation. Just a front. They're collecting money, enforcing rules, and bullying homeowners under the guise of authority they don't legally have. And now, arson. And now arson. Agent Ramirez looked over at Clarice, who had now migrated suspiciously close. Is that the president? She prefers Director of Community Compliance, Ethan said, with a hint of sarcasm. Clarice approached, smiling with a politician's smoothness. Good morning, officers. Terrible incident. I hope everything's okay. Such a shame for the neighborhood. Ramirez didn't blink. Ma'am, we'll need to speak with you later today. Clarice's smile faltered, just a hair. Of course. Always happy to help. She retreated, but not before darting a glance at Ethan. This time, it wasn't smug, it was calculating. Back inside, Jaden sat on the couch quietly, watching cartoons but not really seeing them. His plush dinosaur was clutched tightly in both arms. Ethan sat beside him. I liked our car, Jaden said softly, not looking away from the screen. I did too, Ethan replied, but we'll get a better one, and this time, no one's going to touch it. That afternoon, Agent Ramirez returned with preliminary findings. The burn pattern confirms intentional arson. The ignition source was planted, and the timing was precise. Whoever did this had been watching your house. Ethan nodded. I'm assuming you've cross-referenced security vendors in the area? Already underway. Also, we traced 4 HOA payment accounts to a shell company in Nevada. Owner, Wynn Consolidated Holdings. Clarice. Yep. And then she dropped the bombshell. 2 years ago, a similar case came up in Colorado Springs. Same setup. Fake HOA. Financial abuse. Residents too scared to speak. Property violations that forced sales. That case was dismissed after the key witness recanted, and then disappeared. Ethan felt his jaw tighten. We're dealing with more than a petty suburban scam, Ramirez continued. This looks coordinated, potentially interstate, which means we're escalating the case to federal fraud and organized crime units. You've just opened a much bigger door, Mr. Cole. Ethan didn't smile. He just stood up, walked to the window, and watched Clarice stepping into her car, looking nervously over her shoulder. The war had started, but this time, it wasn't just about Ethan. It was about every homeowner who had been silenced. And he was done being quiet. By the time dusk fell over Juniper Hollow that evening, a quiet paranoia had replaced the once perfect silence. The manicured hedges now looked like barriers. The sidewalk planters, once symbols of order, felt like surveillance markers. People weren't walking their dogs or chatting by the mailbox anymore. They were peeking from behind blinds, because word had spread fast. The FBI was investigating the HOA. But it wasn't just gossip anymore. The investigation was deepening, and Ethan knew it. In the days following the arson, agents interviewed residents under the radar. The black SUVs came early, left late. Drones briefly hovered near the HOA building, scanning for external infrastructure, camera mounts, relay stations, anything electronic. And the deeper they dug, the worse it got. Agent Ramirez brought over a hard drive one morning, slamming it onto Ethan's kitchen table. Encrypted server we seized from a storage unit leased under a fake company linked to Clarice. Took some doing, but your algorithm cracked it. You'll want to see this. Ethan plugged it into his laptop, typing quickly. The files began to open. There were dossiers on almost every homeowner in Juniper Hollow. Names, ages, property value, family status, employment history, even private notes. Some of it was public data, sure, but other things weren't. There were personal emails, surveillance stills, phone call logs, possibly obtained through illegal devices. A separate folder was labeled Compliance Enforcement. Inside, photos of homes with tags like Target, Pressure Tactic Level 2, notes like Fence needs paint issue warning, and worse. Spouse's medical bills high, might comply if fined aggressively. Ethan's skin chilled. This wasn't a rogue HOA. This was organized coercion, built off fear and leverage. Jaden wandered into the kitchen just then. rubbing his eyes. "Hey, bud," Ethan said gently, closing the screen. "You hungry?" Jaden nodded sleepily. "Will the police make them stop being mean to us?" Ethan knelt down to eye level, brushing his son's hair back. "They will. But sometimes bullies wear nice clothes and call themselves leaders. Those are the ones you have to take down carefully." That night, the FBI gathered residents in a discreet meeting at a local church, away from Juniper Hollow. What started as 10 people turned into over 30. And for the first time, people began to talk. Tom Reyes, a retired Air Force pilot, revealed he'd been fined $4,000 over 2 years for a satellite dish fines that were never recorded in the HOA's official books. Lisa Fan, a widowed mother of 2, shared how she was forced to pay for front yard harmonization services she never authorized. When she resisted, her son was followed home from school. Martin and Eleanor Wexler, both in their 70s, confessed they'd been paying an elderly property oversight fee for years, $85 a month, because they were told their age meant increased risk to community upkeep. One by one, voices rose, and Ethan just listened. Not as an investigator, not even as a victim, as an amplifier, because what had started with a car fire had now unveiled something darker. A micro-tyranny hiding in plain sight, feeding off silence. After the meeting, Agent Ramirez pulled him aside. "You've done more than file a report," she said. "You've cracked open a dam." Ethan shook his head. "I didn't do it alone. They just needed someone to take the first swing." The next morning, the headlines came. FBI probes fake HOA in Arizona suburb. Allegations of fraud, surveillance, and coercion. Clarice held an emergency HOA town hall that evening in the community center. She stood at the podium in her usual pastel suit, clutching a folder like it might shield her from the storm. "We are the backbone of this neighborhood," she declared, her voice tight. "This smear campaign is baseless. It's the result of one disgruntled homeowner who refuses to participate in our vision of order." But Ethan stood at the back, arms crossed. Then something happened no one expected. Lisa Fan stood up and spoke. Then Martin, then Tom. One by one, voices rose, not in rage but in truth. Clarice's mask cracked. She snapped. "You ungrateful people wouldn't last a day without us managing your mess." Silence. Then someone whispered, "We managed fine before you." Clarice's hands trembled, because for the first time her grip was slipping, and the people weren't afraid anymore. After the town hall debacle, the air in Juniper Hollow changed. The fear that had long hung over the community like a low-humming electric fence began to dissipate. In its place, something far more dangerous to Clarice Wynn was growing anger. Controlled, focused, righteous. Within 48 hours of the HOA's meltdown meeting, over 24 residents had submitted formal affidavits to the FBI. More still came forward with bank statements, photos of altered notices, and even voice recordings of phone threats Clarice or her compliance officers had left on their answering machines. And that was just the beginning. At Ethan's encouragement, a group of homeowners organized themselves into an independent neighborhood accountability committee. It wasn't flashy, just 6 people in folding chairs on a neighbor's porch, but it was revolutionary for Juniper Hollow. For the first time, residents were meeting without HOA permission. And it felt good. It felt like freedom. On a Thursday afternoon, Ethan met with Special Agent Ramirez and a federal fraud analyst at a nearby field office. They spread open a network map on the screen: nodes, lines, connections. "This isn't just HOA scamming," Ramirez said, pointing to a line connecting Clarice's shell company to a financial services firm in Nevada. "This is structured fraud." They funneled fees into limited liability companies, reported no earnings, and reinvested them in real estate flips in 3 other states. The analyst added, "They've been operating like a mini-criminal enterprise. We're escalating this to a RICO case: racketeering, conspiracy, wire fraud. The works." Ethan leaned forward. "How long until you can move?" "We're prepping the warrants. But we need one final push, something irrefutable, something public. That evening, Ethan walked back through his neighborhood, watching people cautiously watering their plants, kids riding scooters again, chalk drawings returning to sidewalks like silent rebellions. But not everything had healed. Jaden was still waking up from nightmares. And a neighbor, Daniel Scott, a young father of twins, had his tires slashed the day after attending the town hall. Clarice's reach wasn't gone yet. It was cornered, wounded, dangerous. Then came the break they needed. One of the former HOA enforcers, Frank Dalton, showed up unannounced at Ethan's house. Mid-50s, gruff, tired. The kind of man who had once believed he was doing the right thing. He looked like he hadn't slept in days. "I want to talk," Frank said. "Not for a deal. For my conscience." Ethan offered him coffee and called Ramirez. What Frank revealed stunned even the agents. For 3 years, Clarice had enlisted volunteers and security contractors to enforce community discipline. But the real incentives were darker kickbacks from every fine issued, bonuses for families coerced into paying off books, and discretionary funds from community fees funneled into Clarice's personal account under beautification initiatives. "She said people like Ethan were a threat to neighborhood stability," Frank said, his voice heavy. "She called him a virus, told us to isolate him, make him want to leave Busha. When his car burned, she didn't even flinch, just said, 'Message delivered.' That's when I knew we'd crossed a line." His voice broke. "I just wanted to keep the peace. But we became the storm." With Frank's statement recorded and signed, the FBI had what they needed. But Ethan wasn't finished. He called a neighborhood meeting, no permission, no official channels. Just flyers slipped into mailboxes, text messages, word of mouth, and people came. More than ever before. Clarice did too. She stood in the back, arms folded, eyes narrow. But this time, no one deferred to her. No one asked for her input. She wasn't feared anymore. Ethan stood before the crowd, his voice steady but sharp. "We were led to believe rules meant safety, that fees meant community, that silence meant peace. But what we've really had here is exploitation." He held up a file folder. Copies of Frank's testimony, financial audits, surveillance images. "We were never the problem. We were the victims." Clarice stepped forward, voice shrill, shaking. "This is slander. None of it's true." Lisa Fan stood. "Then why did your beautification company have my name on a receipt I never signed?" Martin Wexler rose. "Why did my wife pay $500 for mailbox renovations that never happened?" Clarice spun, looking for support, for the obedient silence she used to command. None came. Ethan's voice dropped to a calm finality. "You burned down my car. You tried to isolate my son. You turned neighbors into suspects. That ends now." Clarice turned and left without another word. The crowd didn't cheer. They didn't need to. They were reclaiming something more powerful than vengeance: dignity. The morning it happened, Juniper Hollow was silent, in a way that no one had ever heard before. Not peaceful tense. The kind of silence that comes before a thunderclap. Even the birds seemed to sense it. At precisely 6:43 a.m., 5 unmarked black vehicles pulled into the neighborhood, scattering dew across pristine driveways. Doors swung open. Federal agents and Navy windbreakers moved with rehearsed precision, not toward one home, but for Clarice's house, the HOA headquarters, and the homes of 2 board members named in the RICO indictment. Neighbors peeked through blinds, coffee halfway to their lips, jaws slack. Ethan didn't peek. He stood on his porch in full view, arms folded, watching as Agent Ramirez led the charge up Clarice Wynn's brick walkway. Clarice answered the door in a silk robe, her face pale, hair disheveled. For once, her performance failed her. "Clarice Wynn," Ramirez said, presenting a federal arrest warrant. "You are under investigation for conspiracy to commit fraud, racketeering, and obstruction of justice." Clarice's eyes darted neighbor to neighbor, window to window. No, no, wait. I have lawyers. This is a mistake. I didn't. You can tell it to a judge, Ramirez replied coldly. Turn around. As they cuffed her in full view of the cul-de-sac she once ruled, Clarice began to scream, not in rage, but in fear. Raw, primal fear. Of consequences. Of exposure. Ethan didn't look away. Another car pulled up. A journalist with a camcorder stepped out, tipped off perhaps by a neighbor, or maybe just by the ripples Ethan had sent across the internet. It didn't matter. The story was going public now. Across the street, HOA board member Alan Chen was being escorted out of his house in silence, refusing to look at his wife, who sobbed on the steps. Another 2 agents emerged from the HOA's headquarters with plastic bins filled with files and hard drives. One labeled Legal Fund was stuffed with receipts for spa treatments, first-class flights, and questionable consultant payments. As Clarice was placed in the back of the federal cruiser, she turned to Ethan, her voice hoarse. You think you've won? Ethan stepped forward slowly, calm, controlled. No, he said. The community won. You just finally got caught. The door shut, and with it, the reign of the HOA collapsed. Within 48 hours, the assets of the Juniper Council were frozen by federal order. Their emergency maintenance fund accounts turned out to be personal piggy banks. FBI investigators released statements confirming over $1.2 million in diverted homeowner fees, misappropriated over 4 years. But even that wasn't the real bombshell, because the documents recovered revealed plans to forcibly annex the remaining non-HOA homes into the association homes like Ethan's by exploiting obscure zoning language and fabricating complaints to trigger foreclosure threats. Ethan's car had been just the beginning. Clarice hadn't been protecting Juniper Hollow. She'd been trying to own it. The community reeled but rallied. In the wake of the arrests, residents formed a legally recognized homeowners group, not to impose order, but to create transparency. The fake fines were voided. The remaining funds recovered. Refund checks were issued. And for the first time in years, no one was afraid to speak at meetings. Ethan was offered a seat on the new board. He declined. I didn't fight to replace one system with another, he told Ramirez. I just wanted people to feel safe again. She smiled. You did more than that. You set the bar. Jaden's nightmares stopped within the week. He drew dinosaurs again, this time with capes. One had Dad written across its chest in crayon. And Clarice, she was denied bail. A federal judge labeled her a flight risk and a danger to potential witnesses. Her trial was pending, and with the mountain of evidence, her conviction was all but guaranteed. The Queen of Juniper Hollow was no more. But her fall wasn't the end. It was the beginning of something much bigger. Spring came late to Arizona that year. Maybe the weather felt like the people, still unsure whether to bloom or retreat. But in Juniper Hollow, something had undeniably shifted. The fear was gone. Gone were the silent looks over hedges. Gone were the whispered questions about who might report you. Instead, front porches began to fill again. Kids returned to the sidewalks. And for the first time in years, the neighborhood felt like it belonged to the people who actually lived in it. Ethan noticed the change in small moments. Jaden was sleeping through the night, sometimes even whistling while brushing his teeth. Neighbors greeted each other at mailboxes without glancing around nervously. Someone even planted sunflowers at the old HOA building, which now stood empty, the gold emblem stripped from the front door like a fallen flag. The real victory, though, wasn't legal. It was emotional. At the community celebration thrown 3 weeks after Clarice's arrest, someone handed Ethan a microphone. He hadn't prepared anything, hadn't planned to speak. But as he looked out over the gathered crowd, fathers, mothers, elderly couples, teenagers volunteering to pass out cookies, he realized how far they'd come. He cleared his throat and spoke simply. What we lost here was trust. What we found again was each other. Applause erupted. Not thunderous, but warm, genuine. The kind of appreciation that doesn't fade when the clapping stops. Later that night, after the lanterns were packed away and the crowd dispersed, Agent Ramirez found Ethan standing alone beneath the soft glow of string lights. "You ever going back to the bureau?" she asked. He shook his head. "No. I think I found my next post." She raised an eyebrow. "Juniper Hollow?" Ethan smiled. "Someone's got to keep the Grass Height revolutionaries in check." They both laughed. But the truth was, Ethan hadn't just helped dismantle a corrupt system. He'd helped build a new culture. One of transparency, of respect, of real community. A few days later, a package arrived at Ethan's door. No return address. Inside was a folded letter, typed, anonymous. "You did what none of us could. You fought back and won. The car was never about fear, it was about control. Thank you for reminding them that control isn't free." At the bottom, a single phrase, handwritten. "They thought they ruled us, but we just needed to remember we had voices." Ethan folded the note carefully and tucked it into a drawer. 1 month later, Clarice Wynn was sentenced to 19 years in federal prison for conspiracy to defraud, racketeering, and aggravated arson. The courtroom was packed. Most of Juniper Hollow watched live from their living rooms, tissues and coffee cups in hand. Ethan didn't celebrate. He sat quietly with Jaden, one arm around his son's shoulder, watching justice do what it does best. Not roar, not lash out, but hold firm. When the broadcast ended, Jaden asked, "So, is it really over?" Ethan looked at him and nodded. "It's over," he said. "And now we get to live." In the months that followed, Juniper Hollow held its first ever community-led board election. No coercion, no intimidation, just neighbors, finally treated like equals. Lisa Fan was elected president. Tom Reyes became treasurer. The Wexlers? They oversaw neighborhood events. And Ethan? He politely declined every nomination sent his way. His job was done. On the 1-year anniversary of the fire, Ethan and Jaden stood in the exact spot where the SUV had exploded. Only now, a bench stood there. It was simple, wooden, hand-carved. On the backrest, a plaque read, "In memory of what we overcame. In honor of those who spoke up. In strength, we found each other." Jaden sat down first. "Think people will remember?" Ethan joined him. "Only if we remind them." And as the Arizona sun rose behind them, pouring light over Juniper Hollow's reborn streets, it became clear. This wasn't just the end of a story. It was the start of something better. Something earned. Something real. A community reclaimed.